Hello everyone, Jester Bell, aka Female Frodo Baggins here, and today we're going to be talking about my least favorite topic of all to talk about on this channel, James Gunn's DCU. But just a little update on it, that I think that James Gunn's DCU has already failed. I think that this is a non-starter and that WB still will not have the MCU that they always wanted to have, and that I think it's only a matter of time now before somebody, let's say Paramount buys WB, decides to give James Gunn the boot after seeing all of the numbers. And in fact, I think that DC as a brand, in terms of its movies and TV right now, is in a worse spot than it was before James Gunn came on. Now, all of this is going to get the James Gunn's fanboys very, very angry at me declaring this, but I don't care because I've come to realize that it doesn't matter what James Gunn does or what fails in the new DC universe, they will never accept that there have ever been any mistakes along the way. But yeah, I am going to defend myself. Why would I come to the conclusion that James Gunn's DCU has already failed? And no matter what the media says about James Gunn and the success of Superman and DCU, why it's just DOA right now. It's just dead. Well, let me explain. First of all, James Gunn was just the worst person to helm DC. That has always been my opinion. Now, I know I have some unpopular opinions where I'm not as big a fan of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies as other people are. The only one I really like is Guardians of the Galaxy 2, but yeah, I've never seen James Gunn to be the brilliant mastermind when it comes to directing like people think he is. His greatest successes were under Marvel, and since doing Guardians of the Galaxy, it's like that's all he knows how to do, and that's all that he brings to these DC movies. But anyway, James Gunn does those Guardians of the Galaxy movies, but he has a very abrasive personality behind the scenes. Had some very awful things that he said in the past, particularly these jokes towards little kids. And, you know, just a bad attitude in general towards people, as seen in other videos and stuff. And he had a bad attitude interacting with people, which is what wound up getting him canceled in the first place, because people were trying to get revenge on him after he was picking fights. But anyway, with all that, he eventually comes back to DC, you know, a new man, I guess. For a while there, doing Guardians of the Galaxy 3 and the Suicide Squad, he was acting a lot nicer and, you know, much more cordial with people, as he is constantly online and constantly interacting with people. But then, of course, we get to James Gunn as the CEO of DC, a guy who has never been in an executive position before, and he is asked to do this job by a person who also was considering Todd Phillips, a guy who is not a fan of DC at all, who also has never been an executive, a guy who did Joker and Joker 2, to run the studio. So yeah, James Gunn eventually got the gig with Peter Safran, but honestly, I never hear from Peter Safran. It seems like it's just James Gunn's show. But let's do a review here of what James Gunn's time at DC has been like. Well, he started off by having to deal with, 4 movies that were still slated to release in theaters and having to market them. All 4 movies, which, by the way, James Gunn did have creative input on the final cut of those films. He's the person who allegedly added George Clooney Batman at the end of The Flash, and he said The Flash was the greatest superhero movie that he'd ever seen. Hilariously, that turned out not to be true, but his first year as DC head was 4 movies flopping at the box office, 4 movies that he couldn't save. So yeah, that was that, but the excuse at the time was these were movies that he didn't greenlight, they just had to get him out of the way. Once James Gunn gets on board with everything, things will be a whole lot better, right? Well, they're not. Now, here's the thing. In order to make an interconnected universe, an interconnected franchise that everyone is enjoying and everyone is on board, and no matter what they say at WB, they still want that MCU level franchise. But James Gunn, his first call of what to do at DC was to create a show called Creature Commandos, a hard R-rated animated show about a team of misfits who teams up together and has to do a mission. You know, it's the same thing as Guardians of the Galaxy, and it was the same thing that he did with the Suicide Squad, and it's the same thing he's doing now. Now, Creature Commandos came out, and nobody watched it, really, and I wouldn't expect people to. It's a hard R-rated show based on obscure DC characters, but James Gunn was saying that this was the first project in this new DC universe that he wanted everyone on board with. But, oh well, okay, so he did one project that was self-indulgent for himself and not really for anyone other than his niche of fans. Fine, fair enough. Let's go over to Superman. A movie that, I gotta tell you guys, whenever James Gunn comes out with a new project, and he's done this with Peacemaker, with the Suicide Squad, and with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, he does it with every one of his new projects. He always says it's his favorite thing that he's ever made. He didn't say that about Superman. In fact, he said that his favorite project in DC hadn't been announced yet. And so Superman is the one movie that he deflected away from calling it his favorite project. Why? Because James Gunn, with a character like Superman, he is ill-fitted for that character. James Gunn is a person who likes obscure characters from comic books and edgy humor from 10 years ago. Superman, this hopeful character that is supposed to be innocent and is supposed to be appealing to everyone, is not a character for James Gunn. So James Gunn comes out with his Superman movie, and he fills it up with another team of Guardians of the Galaxy-esque characters, and it still cannot escape his style of humor, even though it was toned back for this movie. But Superman comes out, and it's terrible. And the thing about it is that it's still got a great reception on Rotten Tomatoes. But if you actually look beyond Rotten Tomatoes, if you actually look at the kinds of videos that regular people have made about the movie, then the movie didn't work for a whole lot of people out there. And that's the whole thing about James Gunn's Superman. I do not think it's a good movie at all. In fact, I think it is the worst superhero movie that James Gunn has ever made. By far. I can say that the Guardians of the Galaxy movies are head and shoulders above this. You know, the cracks in James Gunn's craftsmanship, I would say, were showing even more with Guardians of the Galaxy 3, where I think the only character that he gave an interesting arc to was Rocket. That was the only good part of that movie. Everything else, it was just like he doesn't have anything more to do with characters like Star-Lord and the like, and Gamora's storyline went largely nowhere. So perhaps the cracks were showing in that movie, but there was enough there, you know, enough action and whatnot, that I guess people liked it a lot better. But Superman is just down in the ground, 6 feet under compared to even that film. Superman is so terrible, like a barrage of TikTok videos being watched. Superman himself gets locked away in a cage for a majority of the film, so James Gunn can pal around with the Justice Gang, because Superman is the last character that James Gunn wants to be working on. Not to mention, he completely assassinated the character of Jor-El and turned him into a totalitarian dictator who wants to conquer the earth with Superman and encourages him to make a harem for himself. A joke that James Gunn thought was so funny, he said it 3 times in a row. James Gunn is perfectly proud of the fact that he assassinated Jor-El's character, though. And it was James Gunn, as confirmation, it was James Gunn who took a more naive, childish approach to Superman as a character who apparently is naive about how the world works and isn't even confident in himself by the end. There was a behind-the-scenes reveal that I guess was supposed to make James Gunn look good about a disagreement that he had on set with David Corenswet. David Corenswet did not agree with how the final scene was Superman affirming what he believes and what he stands for and how he's human, really. David Corenswet did not agree with the approach because he said that the approach of it made it sound like Superman was still trying to convince himself of that rather than actually being convinced of that.
Am I just demonstrating? So if I say, that's what it is to be human, that feels like I'm trying to prove it still, as opposed to I really know it.
And James Gunn completely denied all that and insisted they do it his way, which made it sound like Superman was still not confident in himself. James Gunn thought that having Superman not sound confident in himself was going to make him more human, but it actually doesn't complete the character arc in the movie. It's a shame because it seems that David Corenswet understands Superman more than James Gunn, but James Gunn is the word on everything in these movies. It all has to be James Gunn, and he is in charge of every character, regardless if he's the right person for that character or not. And I think it's funny because I think that this clip was released to make James Gunn look good as some sort of empathetic director who really gets these characters and really knows what he's doing, but it did not. But that's another thing about James Gunn, is he has to be involved with everything. David Corenswet and Rachel Brosnahan did a better job marketing this movie than James Gunn, and they seem to even have a better understanding of the characters, but every single interview, every single promotional had to be James Gunn. He needs to be the face of everything. Kevin Feige, for all his faults, can be behind the scenes working on all this stuff and only occasionally give an address to the press, but James Gunn has to make himself the mascot, the face of everything DC, even though he doesn't get all of the characters, and even though with every interview he does about Batman, he seems absolutely clueless as to what to do with that character, saying that every Batman story has been told and Batman is the toughest character to crack even though he's been the easiest. This is outright ridiculous. I don't want to see what a James Gunn Batman is going to look like. He said he doesn't want to make the character goofy, and I think the reason he's bringing that up is because that's the only thing he knows how to do. So how can he do a serious character? Why do we have James Gunn on this character when Matt Reeves is actually making projects that are more successful than James Gunn and better made than James Gunn? But I went off on a tangent there for a minute there. I'm sorry. I got a little bit off track. Let's get back to James Gunn. So Superman comes out and it actually isn't good. It isn't good, and a lot of people agree with that. The whole thing around this movie is that it needed to be good for so many reasons. And so there's this weird defense around the movie. A defense is where I feel like some of that praise that it got from the Rotten Tomatoes critics doesn't even feel genuine, because I feel like people needed this movie to be good so badly. But the mental gymnastics went on about how the movie was doing great at the box office, even though it's not. We are still in a day and age when movies can go $1 billion plus if people like. This movie didn't even beat Man of Steel at the box office, and there has been so much cope around it. It absolutely tanked internationally, a fact that Gunn blamed on the character being too American, even though he made sure that those elements were removed from the character. It just doesn't make any sense. And now, for the Superman box office failure to be complete, an anime movie beat it at the box office. An anime movie, spin-off to a TV show, made more at the box office than a Superman movie, which should tell you something. But in addition to that, the box office of this movie, they put it out on digital, barely a month after it released, and we're still trying to claim that it was a big success. The cope around it, though, was that, they must have been so pleased about how this movie was doing at the box office, they decided that they had made enough money, so they took it out of theaters. What company does that? What company would take a movie out of theaters because it was doing well and just decide, hey, we've made enough, we can go home? This is absurd. Warner Brothers is in debt. You don't think that they would want to make as much money as they could? Not to mention it was also put on streaming very, very early. I guess testament to how well it was doing at the box office. But James Gunn's excuse for Superman and why it went on VOD so early was, it was because of Peacemaker. Yeah. Peacemaker, the hard R-rated show that was a part of the original DC universe that no one watched, and James Gunn tried to claim that it was very highly watched, but we had no actual evidence because HBO Max was not on Nielsen ratings yet, so James Gunn could claim whatever he wants. Now, did I mention that James Gunn has fibbed a lot in his time? Saying a lot isn't going far enough. He lies all the time about stuff that is happening. But Peacemaker, a character brought over to the new DC universe, a character that is a remnant and that's just holding on to the original DC universe, all because they are characters, including James Gunn's wife, who he wanted to keep around, and he even inserted into Superman as a way to keep them around, because he really wanted people to watch Peacemaker. Peacemaker, a hard R-rated show which opens up with a big orgy scene and has lines in later episodes where Lex Luthor who appeared in the Superman movie talking about whatever sexual act he's hearing in the cell behind him. It's very difficult to talk about this show on a channel without getting flagged or anything with what he's put into it, but it's like James Gunn is the same person he's always been with these humor. The reason why James Gunn got canceled in the first place, and I'm not saying that he should have been canceled or that he should have lost his job over this, but I'm saying the reason why he wound up in controversy was old tweets about, old tweets that were PDF-philia adjacent. A lot of these jokes, or not even adjacent, right into it. But, other things that people had found out about behind the scenes, like his list of top 10 most blankable female superheroes, a list that included Jubilee, a teenage character who he acknowledged as a teenage character in his list, saying that I was told that James Gunn was gone, and that's in the past, and he's reformed now, and he's not like that anymore, except for James Gunn is the same person that he's always been. He still has that style of humor. He's just careful about putting it in shows where it's appropriate, where it's appropriate to make those kind of jokes given what the show is, and where he doesn't go far enough with it to get himself canceled. Like, it's still who he is now in these personality on social media, this very abrasive, condescending, mean personality where he is constantly responding to people, sniping at fans just for having questions about why things are happening. That same personality that James Gunn once had is still here. It's in the stuff that he makes, the stuff that he chooses to make, the kind of jokes he chooses to tell, his taste, his show, Peacemaker, where he all of a sudden makes the character played by his wife hook up with every single character in the show while he's directing those scenes. If you want to think about why he's doing that, the same person who made those tweets originally, that same personality, it's still who he is now. It's just he toned it back a little bit after his initial cancellation. And this is the guy that they have as an executive of an entire studio who is making himself the mascot of this studio and putting his face on everything, is still acting like this. And these are still the tastes of the guy that you put in charge of the entire DC universe. But Peacemaker, this big show that apparently he thought it was worth keeping some of the original DC universe for, just to keep these characters, is anyone watching it? No, because as much as James Gunn lied in the past that this was a huge show, we now have evidence of it. We have Nielsen ratings, and Peacemaker has never charted on Nielsen ratings because no one is watching this show. And perhaps it's for the best that people aren't watching this show, because apparently the big thing, the big statement that James Gunn wanted to make for this show is that he makes his character Peacemaker go into a Nazi world that is run by Nazis, which apparently in James Gunn's view means a world where there's clean streets and only white people and minorities are put in cages. Gunn, you know, as bad as it would be to put minorities in cages and whatnot, I think that a world run by Nazi Germany would still look a lot worse than this. Of course, James Gunn's excuse for not making it look worse is he didn't want to make the actress uncomfortable, which James Gunn is just full of it on anything that he says. But now, there's been a million, villainous characters that have been made into Nazis over the decades, and that wouldn't be a problem. It would just be incredibly cliched of James Gunn to do this. But the problem is what James Gunn clearly wants to do with this is he's implicating that this Nazi world he's created where white people live in harmony but chase down black people to put them in cages is not too different from our own right now. Wow. James Gunn, this world you created isn't too different from ours right now. Brilliant insight, but I feel that the guy just writes this stuff for Twitter and for Blue Sky and for Threads because that's where he's on all the time. He's doing it so we can get a million retweets from people who are brain dead and affirm him. Yeah, this is eerily close to how it is living in America today. Just a brilliant insight, James Gunn. But the problem isn't just that his political commentary is brain dead and that he doesn't know how to write. The problem is who he is implicating as who he thinks the Nazis are in real life. So I'm going to say that means that I think the only way he's getting away with this is that barely anyone is watching this show, because if he's going to be that abrasive and confrontational with what is going to be a very large portion of his audience, then you cannot have a giant franchise if these are the people that you are going to vilify in your universe. But of course, apparently, according to James Gunn, if I'm acknowledging that this is polarizing messaging that he is leaning towards, then that makes me a racist, because he said in a recent interview that completely unprompted, by the way, someone was just congratulating him on Peacemaker for whatever reason, and he completely unprompted said, sure, there's some racists out there that have called me polarizing, but I don't care. Now, James Gunn, I'm sure if these were actually racists you're talking about, they would call you a lot worse than polarizing, but okay then, my dude, But this is why I believe that the DC universe is in such a worse place than it was before, because everything is James Gunn. In the same way that Kevin Feige is now essentially the person in charge of what every Marvel movie is, and it doesn't really feel like it's director-driven anymore, every single project is going to be James Gunn. Like the Supergirl movie, it's directed by Craig Gillespie, a director I actually like. It's not going to be a Craig Gillespie movie. It's going to be a James Gunn project. All of these things cater to James Gunn's taste. That is why we're getting punch-drunk Supergirl. I guess that's why we're getting a Clayface horror movie. Every single decision he has made, I guess, apart from being forced to do Superman, which is a decision that had to be made because that's what WB wanted, like everything is just what he wants and everything is just catering to his niche fan base that is going to like whatever he does. That is entirely what James Gunn is all about here. But the problem is, as we see from box office and from ratings for these shows, is that it doesn't appeal to a lot of people. So if you have a guy who without the restrictions of Marvel cannot appeal to a lot of people, then how do you expect this DC universe to continue for long? And James Gunn has confirmed in interviews that WB has given him free reign to do whatever he wants with this stuff. He is not held back anymore. This is who he is on his own without much producer insight, putting any restrictions on him. And he is terrible on his own. He can't make good shows. He can't make good movies. And he doesn't even make them that are very appealing to a wide amount of people. He blames the international box office failure on the fact that Superman is too American. No, James, it's because your movies and projects are terrible and they're not appealing to a lot of people. Let's not act like this movie did that well domestically either. So to me, it's only a matter of time now. I know Supergirl isn't going to get much at the box office, Punch-Drunk Supergirl, James Gunn's Supergirl. I know that Clayface won't either. I guess he's got his Superman sequel that he's confirmed is not a Superman sequel because he could not care less about that character. It's only a matter of time because despite all of the gaslighting on how well this stuff is actually doing, sooner or later, someone is going to come along. Like, let's say it's Paramount. If they buy WB, they're going to look at the numbers and be like, oh, this guy isn't actually that successful with this stuff, and he'll get the boot. And I guess maybe he's just soaking up as much money as he can get as an executive as he can now. But it's unfortunate because the reason why I criticize all this stuff is I always thought DC has a lot of potential and it could make really great stuff, and this Superman movie and all of that, it's not living up to its true potential. But unfortunately, the next era of DC, after Zack Snyder, after the Limbo days, like, even in the Limbo days post Zack Snyder, it was more likely you would get a good movie because they let so many different people make their own choices, and it was like no one had the reins. So it meant you might occasionally get something good off of the DCU pre-James Gunn. But now it's all going to be James Gunn, and he is not a good executive and not a good writer. So it's only a matter of time before either a project fails enough and he's gone, which it will, or a producer, an executive above James Gunn finally looks over and says, hey, you're not actually doing that well. We don't need you here anymore. But until that happens, there is going to be nothing for me from the DC universe, and there's going to be nothing for most people because James Gunn and his terrible projects are made very specifically for a certain niche, his own niche of James Gunn's fans, and they're not for anyone else. So yeah, that's why his DC universe has already failed, because he has made it for the smallest audience possible, and there is no way for this to branch out into a bigger franchise like the MCU was, like I know WB still wants, as long as James Gunn is the one calling the shots, and James Gunn's tastes are inserted into everything. But that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you for this rant. Hopefully, I don't have to talk about James Gunn and DC for the foreseeable future. What do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to support my work, please consider becoming a member or a patron, and I will see you guys next time.